I'm Kevin Kenny. I'm a historian and the director of Glucksman Ireland House. Welcome, everyone. If you haven't been to the house before, we have great events here every Thursday evening. We'll have a history lecture or a novel to be launched or panel discussion. So please drop by at any time. Our lecture this evening, as you know, we have Professor Niall Ó Dochartaigh, Professor of Political Science and Director of the MA in Public Policy at the University of Galway. Niall is one of three Fulbright scholars that we have with us this semester at unusually large cohort, and it's great to have three. I see the other two are here. Hilary Bishop and Conall O'Farty at the back. So welcome both of you and everyone. Niall has published extensively on the Northern Ireland conflict and on peace negotiations. His publications include Civil Rights to Armalites, Derry and the Birth of the Irish Troubles, two co-edited books, among others, Political Violence in Context and Dynamics of Political Change in Ireland. His most recent book, Deniable Contact, Back-Channel Negotiation in Northern Ireland, was awarded the Brian Farrell Book Prize of the Political Studies Association of Ireland and was shortlisted for the Christopher Ewart Biggs Literary Prize. Professor Ó Dochartaigh, as I mentioned, is currently Fulbright-Ireland Fellow based here in Glucksman Ireland House, where he's carrying out research on US civil society peacemaking efforts during the Northern Ireland Troubles, a topic obviously of great interest to all of you and to us here in particular in Glucksman Ireland House, with the role of Loretta Brennan Glucksman, Ted Smith, and others in that process back in the 1990s. Professor Dochartaigh will lecture for about 45 minutes, at which point I will ruthlessly cut him off because we love to have conversations in this house, and Niall will be willing to take questions. You can sit here right in the front if you like. One final reminder, and a reminder to myself as well as to you, if you would silence your cell phones if you have them on. We are recording the event. During the Q&A, we will pass microphones around the room. If you could use the microphone, it'll pick up much better on the audio. To let you in on the little secret, our events do go on YouTube. We don't tell you that in advance because we wouldn't have anybody here. But no, seriously, if you want to watch this event or any of our very substantial archive of public events, you'll find them on the Glucksman Ireland House YouTube channel. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Niall Ó Dochartaigh.
Thanks, Kevin, for that really nice introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming along this evening. It's particularly nice to see some old friends here who I've known for many years, and the other two Fulbright fellows here, Hilary and Conall. I want to start with a word of thanks to Kevin Kenny and everyone at Ireland House who have made me really welcome since I arrived in New York a few weeks ago. They've opened the doors. They've been so helpful and kind and welcoming. And I want to thank the Fulbright-Ireland Commission for making it possible for me to spend 6 months in New York on my new research project, which looks at US connections to the Northern Ireland conflict and peace process. So this evening, I'll talk about a secret channel of communication that linked the British Prime Minister to the leadership of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, through the same intermediary over a span of more than 20 years. And I say British Prime Minister deliberately because this channel was so intensely secret that the British members of the British government were not aware that it existed. Only the Prime Minister and the minister responsible for Northern Ireland knew that such a secret channel existed. along with a small number of intelligence officers and civil servants who were directly involved. So extraordinary secrecy. And they spoke in code on the phone all of the time to conceal the interaction, primarily to conceal the interaction from their own security forces, that other intelligence services or bodies would not become aware that this was taking place. So I've written about this in my book, Deniable Contact, which came out a couple of years ago. And I'm at the very beginning, this channel was used, first of all, for the exchange of political positions. So for general discussion about where the British government was going and where the IRA were going. It was then used to negotiate a series of one-off incidents, including IRA kidnappings and the transfer to Northern Ireland of IRA prisoners in England. It was through this channel that an IRA ceasefire was negotiated in 1975. And during that ceasefire, IRA and British government representatives held regular secret meetings over a period of several months. They simultaneously arranged public meetings with the Sinn Féin, the political party associated with the IRA, specifically to divert attention, media attention, from the secret talks that were taking place 70 miles away in another city. It was through this channel as well that negotiations took place in 1980 and 1981 in efforts to end the Irish Republican hunger strikes in which 10 men died. The channel was activated again in the early 1990s and played a crucial role in bringing about the IRA ceasefire of 1994, which in turn opened the way to an inclusive settlement that brought Sinn Féin, the party associated with the IRA, into the political system and into government. This channel directly involved several British prime ministers in succession. So we see even Margaret Thatcher, the most uncompromising of British prime ministers, is personally editing messages to be sent to the IRA through this channel. Her officials are writing what they plan to send the IRA, and then she's scratching things out and she's putting in her own wording. So you have very, very direct involvement of successive prime ministers in this communication. It involved the same intermediary throughout, the same individual. That's one of the most extraordinary things. This evening, I'll outline how and why this channel was first established. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the centrality to this channel of former colonial officials and of Britain's foreign intelligence service, MI6. And argue that the colonial dimension to this engagement, the sort of colonial influence, actually had, on the whole, a positive impact on the process, was an aid to moving the process. And I'll finish off by offering some thoughts on what this channel tells us about the dynamics of back-channel negotiation more generally. But first of all, I want to convey a sense of the richness of an extraordinary private archive that has helped to unlock the secrets of this back-channel communication. And this is an extract from a diary that forms part of this private archive. It was an archive assembled by the intermediary, who was the key contact between the British government and the IRA on repeated occasions over a span of more than 2 decades. He was a businessman from the second largest city in Northern Ireland, Derry. His name was Brendan Duddy. This is an image from the diary he kept throughout the secret talks between the IRA and the British government in 1975. So every day through the whole of 1975 into early 1976, he writes these densely packed entries. So the British and the IRA are meeting face to face every week or every 2 weeks, but in between, he's heading off to meet the British and he's heading off to meet the IRA, and he's reporting on all of these encounters. And there is a kind of passion and a candor about these entries that you are simply not going to get from the records made available by either of the parties to negotiation, the British or the IRA. So I'll just give you a short extract from this. He writes, here he writes, I went to Belfast at 4, arrived at 6 p.m. I was unhappy I was on edge all day as I feel the position is sliding. The meeting in Belfast lasted 8 hours. I left at 2:45 a.m. and it's a feature of these engagements that they often last through the night. Conversations often last till 4 or 5 in the morning. He says that the entire discussion was on how best to answer the recent IRA reply. I pointed out that the IRA needed visible signs on the ground. Of course, the IRA are interested in long-term political gains, but they can't live with pressure on the ground. So it's just an example of just the extraordinary level of and also the sense of emotion and passion that's absent from the official records. And here, this really conveys a sense of creeping despair as the ceasefire begins to break down and they move back to violent conflict that will continue for another 20 years beyond this attempt to resolve. I wanted to mention one aspect of the intermediary. He was a good competitive middle distance and long distance runner. He ran competitively. Before the conflict broke out, he was actually involved in negotiations about the Irish border when he was involved in discussions on whether to unify the athletics associations in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So he had this it was athletics that gave him his first experience of negotiating on sensitive issues surrounding the Irish border. But it also gave him this stamina, determination, and persistence of a long distance runner that was absolutely essential to the role. So as I mentioned, you know, this entry shows him coming home at 2:45 a.m. There are, during the hunger strikes of 1981, there are phone calls that go from midnight till 5:30 in the morning, in which every sentence is important, in which everything has to be exactly right, and you have to keep going for hour after hour after. So there's this sheer physical stamina is an essential part. I met Brendan Duddy several years ago. I started interviewing him. So I started talking to him. First of all, he wouldn't let me record him. Then he started to let me tape the interviews. Initially, I didn't know exactly what he'd been involved in. It gradually emerged. And after several meetings and 2 years had elapsed, one day in his study, he said, you know, I kept documents, I kept materials. And he opened this cupboard and there was a whole series of box files. And he said, yeah, what do you think I should do with this? So I said, I would write a book on that, I have to say. But it's extraordinary. And what all of these engagements give him is an extraordinarily good understanding of the British state and how it operates. He comes to understand bureaucracy because the British explained to him why something has been blocked, why some department doesn't want this prisoner transferred, but another department is working on it. And he starts to understand their record keeping. He sees the notes that the IRA are keeping very detailed notes. He sees those notes. He sees that because the British share some notes with him, they tape him, and then they show him the notes of the conversations with him. So he sees everybody else is keeping records, so he starts to keep his own records. Part of it is diaries. So during all the key phases, he keeps diaries of one kind and another. They change over time. But it includes an extraordinary range of materials. I'm just going to show you one image that captures the breadth of it. So this is a receipt from Häagen-Dazs Cafe in London from the 19th of November, 1993. He wrote on it Michael Oakley, who was MI6 head of counter-terrorism, previously head of MI6 in the Middle East. And before that, the man who'd been in charge of negotiating the 1975 ceasefire with the Allies. So he kept this just to have proof, to have a record of when he met him. That's when we met. So it's full of these like envelopes with a dozen scribbled words on the back of it. And he worked with his son-in-law to sort of make sense of these documents and try to remember them, catalog them before I ever saw them. So that's just one example. I'm going to show now a few other images that illustrate the character of the collection and its value as a source. So the first is actually the one that I showed you before, and I talked about this. It sort of conveys that ebbing hope. So I want to talk as well about the value of the archive beyond the documents that are in it. So in addition to providing all of these materials, it helps to unlock the other sources that are available. It helps to unlock the state papers because it provides dates, times, places, clues that you can look at these dates in the state papers and say, okay, what do they have to say about this? What were they doing at this time? So one of the most important documents in the archive is an elliptic and cryptic chronology of the back channel's early years, whose authorship is unclear. It seems to have been written by a British intelligence officer. There's a black humor to it, but it's also an attempt to set out a chronology of how the channel developed. So this is the first paragraphs of that. It's an unnamed document, an undated document, and it begins September 72 to January 73, phase 1. In September 1972, MI6 officer Frank Steele met a man from Derry who offered to be an intermediary with the IRA. Frank Steele wrote up his report, didn't name who the person was, but submitted his report, said, please bring this to the attention of the Prime Minister, and then wrote a series of reports on the meetings he had with that individual over the following 4 months. The last meeting was in January 1973. So this gives us added confidence in saying he's meeting with this man, Bernard Duddy. I mean, already the evidence suggests that, but this gives us another level of certainty. And it also marks that as the beginning of this engagement, and it drops off then for several months. So Frank Steele's initial reports on his contact with the intermediary tell us a great deal about the origins of this channel. So one of the most, I'll just read this out. He says, a Northern Irish Catholic resident in Londonderry, so it's a Catholic in Derry, who's an old friend of Rory O'Brady of the Provisional IRA, actually the president of Sinn Féin, and the lead contact with the British in this channel for the first 10 years. So an old friend of his has approached 2 contacts of mine separately in Derry, asked them to pass the following message to me and asked me to meet him. So the key thing is the initiative is being taken by this individual, not by the IRA or by the British intelligence services. And this is, Steele agrees to meet him. And he describes this very first encounter. He says his views are strongly Republican, by which Steele really just means that he's in favor of a united Ireland. He wants the goals that the Republican movement is pursuing through violence, but he doesn't want violence. His views are Republican, but he expresses them in a sensible and moderate way. So one thing is, this is a biased intermediary or a biased mediator in that he's clearly aligned from the beginning with one position, and he never conceals that, and he never pretends otherwise. He doesn't say, I'm here as a neutral, someone with a neutral position. He doesn't personally believe in violence, but thinks that had there not been violence, the problems of the minority in Northern Ireland would never have been brought properly to the attention of Her Majesty's government. So he's trying to, while opposing violence, to have a clear-eyed understanding of its political effects and its political. He wants Ireland to be united, but with the consent of the Protestants in the north, so no compulsion, no coercion. And then he says, in this meeting, he proffered another proposal, that we should inform and explain in advance to the president of Sinn Féin, Rory O'Brady, any major moves we propose to make. He said it would be useful if our thinking could be explained to the president of Sinn Féin, Rory O'Brady. He was willing to offer himself as a channel for this, provided it was done completely securely, so that his name will not get out. He's a businessman, he has connections with people across the political divide. He can't afford to be identified. And actually, as time goes in, you see that there's a meeting between a senior loyalist paramilitary and a British official, where the loyalist paramilitary, and they killed an awful lot of people. He said, oh, we'd really love to know who this intermediary was. I wonder who that. And I said to the intermediary, after years of talking to him, I said, you know, it strikes me, actually, you could easily have been killed, you know, really was a risk. And he said, I wouldn't rule it out yet. So there's, it's like, it was on his mind, you know, it was so completely securely. But what I'm struck by here is the initiative is coming from this person at the center, and the Sinn Féin people said on the other end, they said he came to us and he said, look, if you ever want to contact the British, I have a way to contact them. So he actually created this thing and started trying to draw them together. But phase one ended in January 1973, and it ended on the initiative of the intermediary. He said, I don't want to meet you anymore. After efforts to get the MI6 officer to make some sort of gesture towards the IRA and failing, he says to Steele, that he had given him no information nor anything which he could use as an inducement to get the provisional IRA to cease fire. He felt that he was wasting his time. So he said, if you're not going to offer anything through this channel, there's no point. So it closed down then, and the British started a power sharing initiative that was aimed at bringing the moderates together, moderate unionists and nationalists, and excluding extreme groups like the IRA and loyalist paramilitaries. That power sharing government collapsed, was brought down. A new government came to power in Britain under Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, and it started looking around for other ways forward. And that new government reopened this channel. Now, it opened, well, a key moment in its reopening was negotiation around a specific incident. And again, the chronology is really valuable in pinpointing that. So it talks about 14th and 29th of November as the opening of phase two. I'm still not entirely sure what happens on those days, so I haven't managed to track that. But to the first to the 4th of January, conversations at night in 5 languages about a particular problem are negotiations surrounding the kidnapping of Thomas Niedermayer, the West German consul in Belfast. He's kidnapped. It seems likely the IRA leadership did not authorize it, but it was IRA members who kidnapped him. He's actually, as he tries to escape, he's beaten by them and is killed. He's killed by them trying to escape, but nobody knows that. In fact, they don't know that for even months or even years afterwards. So, but also the IRA leadership is not fully aware of what's going on. So Niedermayer's kidnapping was the first occasion on which this channel, this intermediary, was used to deal with an urgent and immediate problem rather than exchange of positions. It was the first time that an offer of reciprocal exchange was made by the British government to the IRA, and the West German government played a crucial role in stimulating this exchange. So you look at those dates, you go to the British archives, you see the German ambassador visits the Home Secretary, says, Are you in contact with the IRA? Are you negotiating with them? Rumor has it they want the transfer of prisoners, including the Price sisters, which many people know a lot more about because of Say Nothing. Would you really not be willing to transfer those prisoners to prisons in Northern Ireland? Would that really be too much for you? And he then, the German ambassador, that night goes to meet the British Prime Minister, Edward Heath. And he says, your Home Secretary tells me won't negotiate. Are you at least keeping communication channels open? Prime Minister says, while I can't promise we will negotiate, we will seek a channel of communication with them to find out what the situation is. And the intermediary, Brendan Duddy, proves the most reliable channel. So through him, they seek information on what's going on. And on the night of the 1st to the 2nd of January, which is the beginning of the conversations in 5 languages, a senior British official, James Allen, writes a note so after a conversation between midnight and 1:20 a.m. He says, message from James Allen to the IRA, release N, release Niedermeyer, and there will be no publicity. So the British government is saying, you let him go, we'll just forget about the whole thing. Now that's okay, that's not much of an offer, you might say, but it's an attempt, it's a reciprocal offer. You do something, we will do something. It may look minimal to you. And then there are written records that describe the conversations with the intermediary Brendan, who's always anonymous, he's never named, but to describe the conversations with him about this and how he might convey it. Anyway, after this, the British absolutely trust him. He's turned out to be the most reliable source of information. His information is accurate. He doesn't gloss over things. He doesn't leak. Lots of intermediaries leak. They go to parties and they can't, after a few drinks, can't help themselves from telling the Australian ambassador that actually they're helping to organize secret talks. The Australian ambassador, of course, immediately tells the British ambassador, and the British report this back and say, you know, this guy leaks, don't go near him. So Duddy didn't leak. That was a crucial thing. And one way in which he achieved that was not to, well, he almost completely ended his socializing and his interaction with other people. He felt that was sort of the only way he could guarantee he wouldn't talk. Okay, so the exchanges surrounding this kidnapping gave the British government confidence in his reliability as an intermediary. And in a series of stages through 1974, they moved towards this IRA ceasefire of 1975 and an engagement over months that ultimately runs into the sand, but is extraordinarily detailed, and they attempt to cooperate and they attempt to prevent the violence beginning again, and it just runs out for various reasons. The next item from the archive that I want to show you comes from the negotiation of the 1981 hunger strikes. Beside his telephone in his house, the intermediary had like this hardback notebook with a red cover. And the first half of that notebook is just shopping lists or phone messages. And the last one here, America, fly, who knows what. And then suddenly, because it's a notebook beside the phone, it's where he writes down the communications between the British government and the IRA over the 1981 hunger strike. And this, when we brought it into our archive in University of Galway, and we then made it freely available online so that everybody could see this. When it was made available, it was the first written record. It was the only record because the British did not send paper. All messages were conveyed orally, so there will be no paper record. So this is the original written record, if you like. But of course, it's one person's notes. How much can you rely on this? A year or two later, because this is a record of phone calls, the British released their notes of the same phone calls, the full record. And maybe they were prompted by this to do that. I can't be sure because I'm not sure they generally release that kind of thing. So the British would like there be 2 pages on the phone call. You know, in a single phone call, there'd be a 2-page report that would go to the Prime Minister, and they showed that these phone calls, 5 or 6 hours, were negotiating phone calls. What about this? What if we make that move? What if the IRA makes this move? And it begins with this proposal that if the hunger strike ended, the prisoners would get their clothes after lunch, before the afternoon. What would happen as they cleaned out their cell, and so on, fine detail. When the British archives were opened, we could see that this was not actually a British position. This was the intermediaries suggest. So he'd written down what he was going to suggest to the British. So that was curious. Until the British opened their archives, we thought this was a British position. But it wasn't. It's the intermediaries suggesting one. And those images from what he called the Red Book, one of the things they illustrate most starkly is the pressure of time during a hunger strike and the absolute centrality of time pressure to the negotiation. So the IRA sends a message saying hunger striker John MacDonald is pledged to die unless he achieves the conditions required by the prisoners for a settlement. That's the message that the intermediary has been asked to convey to the British. And he's writing down here 11:58, 11:59, because the British have said, we'll get back to you at midnight. So it goes 11:59, 11:58, but then it goes to 12, no message, 1, no message, 1:33, no message, 2:10 a.m., no message. Finally, the call comes after 2 o'clock in the morning. And the British convey another position. But what happens is you can't tell when a person's going to die. At 6 a.m., the hunger striker dies, while everybody thinks they still have another 36 hours going on what a time would pre. But it just shows the absolute intensity. If the call is not there at midnight, it makes a difference. It makes a colossal difference. And both sides are managing time. They're delaying, they're holding off. What's very striking is that neither side gives a position. They're in contact for several days. They don't state their positions until 24 hours before the expected. They withhold positions. They're sort of moving around, sort of hinting at what might be possible, but they don't give a formal statement of position. The papers also offer really intriguing evidence of cooperation and the development of a limited sense of common purpose between those operating at this intersection between the IRA and the British government. So I'm going to show you an entry from the 1975 diary in which the intermediary records an appeal he made to the British to make minor moves that would shore up the position of the commander of the IRA in Belfast, who was facing internal opposition to this. So Duddy records in the diary, says, message to British Sunday morning, be generous, give McKee, the Belfast IRA commander, a chance, consider his position. He needs help. Pull out some Marine commandos from West Belfast, release 19 internees, crucially give the names to McKee. We're all in this together. So you get these appeals like, if you want them to maintain this, you're going to have to help them maintain their position and help them to convince others. The final substantive thing I'll talk about, the kind of empirical material that I want to spend time on is this colonial dimension to the British engagement with the IRA, and it's really striking. So of the several intelligence officers and diplomats who engaged in face-to-face meetings with the IRA on a series of occasions over these years, for almost every single one of them, this engagement with the IRA was the first time they had been posted to the United Kingdom. Almost all of them came from foreign postings to take over this engagement. This is an example of Frank Steele, who wrote those first reports. Here he is with explorer Wilfred Taziger in Kenya in 1970. They'd gone on trips all over Jordan, Iraq, and Kenya over the past 2 decades. But to give you a sense of Frank's sort of the importance of the colonial dimension of Frank Steele's experience, Well, Steele was born in India. He served in the British Army in India and Malaya in the late 1940s. He then spent 2 years as the colonial official in charge of the West Nile district of Uganda. He then joined MI6, was posted first to Basra in southern Iraq, then posted to Cyprus during the insurgency against the British, then to Libya, Lebanon during negotiations for power sharing there, to Jordan, and then to Kenya during the Mau Mau rebellion. He comes from Kenya to Belfast, and within a number of months has arranged for early talks between the IRA and a British government minister. But his background is particularly steeped in the colonial history of the empire, but it's also typical of most of the officials. So his successor, Michael Oatley, before he comes to Belfast, has served only in West African and East African postings. And then British diplomat Donald Middleton, who took over in the middle of the talks with the IRA in 1975. I'm just going to show an image of Middleton here. This is Middleton 3 months before he takes over the negotiations with the IRA. Anybody recognize the airline in the background? It's the CIA-run Air America. He is waiting to get on one of the last flights out of Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, as the Khmer Rouge advance on the city. The startled look in his eyes is because several mortars had just landed by the airport terminal as they waited to get on. A week before this, he had evacuated all British civilians and embassy staff who were still left. He flew out to Saigon. The North Vietnamese were closing in on the outskirts of the city. 4 weeks later, Saigon fell and Middleton was flown out and the British embassy was abandoned. Several weeks after that, he was dealing with the IRA. Before Phnom Penh, he'd been Abad in Nigeria. Before that, head of Chancery in Saigon for some of the most intense years of the Vietnam War. So this is the kind of person who is being sent to engage with the IRA. And it lasts into the 1990s, much longer than you would think. So John Deverill, who's director and coordinator of intelligence in Northern Ireland in the 1990s, and who manages the channel, he's not the one who meets with the IRA, but he manages that channel in the 1990s. His father was a colonial governor in the Caribbean. He was born in Kenya. His first job was in the the King's African Rifles, helping to repress the Mau Mau rebellion again, like so many others. He subsequently joined the British Colonial Service and served as a district officer in Fiji in the South Pacific in its final years before independence. So like the depth of sort of colonial experience that these people had was really striking. Now, obviously, colonialism, bad word, or bad thing, bad word. But I want to suggest that the fact that you had these people involved was a very positive thing, because the history of British colonialism in the 50s and 60s is, yes, one of counterinsurgency, but also one of engagement, of negotiation, and all over the world of withdrawal and compromise and a willingness to contemplate deep changes. And so I think these people brought with them, first of all, a diplomatic approach, a diplomatic sensibility. They treated it as a kind of international engagement. They were used to dealing with people who used violence against the British state, and used to the idea that even though someone used violence, you might nonetheless engage with them to in pursuit of some kind of mutually acceptable agreement. Okay, I'm going to go straight on to make some final points about the value of back-channel negotiation. I'll wait through. I mentioned that this channel was concealed not only from government ministers, but also from the highest levels of the military and the police. And one reason was to protect these efforts from people who might oppose it internally. So there might have been people within the security forces hostile to the idea of engaging with people who were shooting at them and bombing and killing their members. So partly it was to bypass potential internal opposition. And that's the same thing happened in South Africa in the early 90s, and at a time of hope in Israel-Palestine, the early 90s as well, around the Oslo process. It was the same situation. These engagements were hidden from the highest levels of the military in South Africa and in Israel-Palestine as well. Okay, and the idea is secret contact makes it possible to determine if compromise is possible and to make enough progress secretly that when it comes out into the open, those opposed to engagement may see the value of that engagement and the progress. It's also valuable because what's clear from this back channel is, contrary to the findings of earlier research on back channels, it's a very short chain. British Prime Minister is directly involved. The leadership of the IRA is directly involved. There's, maybe one person between them and the intermediary. So you have the highest levels on both sides intimately involved in this. So people with the authority. So it's a very kind of direct, involving the highest levels. You build, through engagement in the channel, you build limited trust. It has to be emphasized. So you trust that, and the British write about this in their records. They say, okay, we've established A, B, and C. That the other party has the capacity to stand by its commitments, it's able to, and it will. If it says we'll do it, they'll do it. So that's to trust that the other side will do what they say is really significant thing. So the back channel allows you to test that. Can they do it? And will they do it? That they won't directly lie. Of course, they'll mislead, they'll misdirect, they're in conflict, they may go back to violent conflict again, but they won't directly tell us a straightforward lie to our face. They'll just mislead us and dissemble and be disingenuous. They won't tell us something that's completely untrue. And they'll respect protocols for contact. They won't attempt to kidnap or kill or arrest people, even though they know someone from the other side is going to be in a particular place at a particular time. Just one final point about the value of a back channel is the clarity of communication. And this is in an interview I did with Brendan Duddy, the intermediary, many years ago. He said to me, you have everything you read in the media, or you took it as the exact opposite. His point was, when the IRA speak in public, or Sinn Féin spoke in public, and when the British government speak in public, they're addressing multiple audiences. And so they have to say something to reassure the unionists. They have to say something to the Conservative Party backbenchers. They have to also try to convey something to the IRA. And the IRA similarly has to maintain the confidence of its followers. So they're speaking to multiple audiences. And when the other side looks at these messages, they're like, okay, which bit is for us? Like, is there something for us in here? Or is it? And so the point is that through a back channel where you're passing messages, you know this is only for us. Nobody else is seeing this. Nobody else. We know this is exactly what they want to say to us. And it can also be used to clarify the public communication. So I interviewed John Chilcott, who was deeply involved in this channel in the 1990s. He said remarks which are made in public, which are designed to carry a particular and precise message. So they are directed at the IRA, but they're made in public. You can then interpret them privately through a back channel if you've got one to say, this is what we mean by what we are saying in public. This is the bit that's intended for you. Concluding remarks. I'll try to make them brief. The back channel allowed for a kind of really odd, very bumpy, very awkward coordination. Nonetheless, a coordination of British policy and Irish Republican strategy. So two parties, but one involved in armed violence against the state, one seeking to repress that violence and defeat it, with different goals, beginning to coordinate their positions and coordinate their trajectory to the extent that you get, ultimately, this is Martin McGuinness in the middle, who was believed to be the most important military commander in the IRA. Jerry Adams, you'll all quote the disclaimer from Say Nothing. You may know this disclaimer thing, he's never in the IRA. With Prime Minister Tony Blair, that's a stage at which things have come out into the open. But by that stage, they have a genuinely cooperative relationship. And the thing about the back channel is that the seeds of that cooperation there's a sort of understanding of how far the other side can go, what you might need to do to assist them, and the idea that you're sort of dependent on one another to some extent. So it's the beginning of the building of a new and less conflictual relationship. I don't want to say, so back channels work, they're great. No, of course not. They don't, they collapse, they're disastrous. But when they do work, when the two sides are sort of determined to try to work something out, have enough shared interests, that secret negotiation can play a really important role in transforming the relationships. Thank you. Yes, very happy to take questions. I see, yeah, a couple.
Thank you so much. This is super, super interesting. I was particularly interested with the discussion of a biased intermediary. Normally, when we think about mediations of this sort, the unbiased nature of them is a huge positive. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the positives and negatives of having Brian Doty in this context as actually a biased person here.
Yeah, so actually there's quite a literature on this by mediation scholars. So that it's not that uncommon to have a biased mediator. It actually happens quite frequently. And there are clear advantages to that. One is that the party they're associated with has trust in them, is more likely to listen to them and more likely to take their advice, so that they're sort of associated with that position. The people know, well, actually, ultimately you want to go in the same political direction as us, even if you want us to make an agreement and end violence. So more trust by one side, and that can be whether you have a powerless mediator, and the mediator / intermediary in this case, the mediation literature says effectively an intermediary is a mediator. There's no distinction between the two. Inevitably, when you are bringing messages back and forth, you end up interpreting and explaining and seeking to convince people. But whether they're powerless or a power mediator, it can be a very useful thing to be by. So this intermediary is powerless, but one of the best examples of power mediators whose values lies in their allegiances is something like the role of Russia, not in Ukraine, but in negotiations surrounding Serbia. And Serbia made a deal because Russia, its close ally, kind of said, okay, we're strongly in favor of this deal. So they were a biased mediator, if you like, but played an important role in moving Serbia, in that case, towards a settlement without ever becoming hostile to Serbia. Yeah, so sorry, that's a long answer. But yeah, there's a value, there's clear value. And the question about the unbiased mediator, yeah, it's right. And this mediator is embedded, completely embedded. And this is the primary channel. Many people are trying to mediate. And there are some other important channels, but this is the only channel that is from the British Prime Minister to the leadership of the IRA. Yeah, I saw.
I join with everyone in thanking you very much for particularly interesting discussion and informative. The question that occurs to me is where these back channel discussions took place over such a long period of time, and the IRA remained the IRA, but the British powers that be evolved and changed over time. how were these sensitive discussions handed on from one prime minister to another?
That's a great question. And I didn't, because of time, I didn't explain clearly enough that the phases of negotiation are intermittent. So there is a channel from late 72, more or less continuously to 1977. So that is the longest stretch. And then in 80-81, it's just reopened for a period of several months around the hunger strikes. Then it opens up again between 90 and 93 for 3 years. So it's intermittent contact. But some of the people involved keep in touch privately in between those phases of official contact. So you don't, in most cases, you don't have to have handover. So 90 to 93 is conservative government. And so it's all within, it's first of all under Margaret Thatcher, it's opened, surprisingly, then continues under John Major. Frank Steele, that's the phase one is under the Heath, the conservative government. Now the next phase from 74 through to 77, that does see a transition from the Heath government to a Labour government. And I'm trying to think, it doesn't transition at a moment where there is a kind of firm, regular series of contacts. It's actually a channel that the Conservatives has used a couple of times, and the officials are aware of it, and they can, Labour comes in, presumably they're told, and they're happy for it to be used as well. But there's no sort of discussion of, I haven't found any discussion in the British archives of a kind of formal handover, because the direct contact has been dealt with by the intelligence officers of MI6, so they maintain those contacts even when the government changes.
Niall, thank you so much for a brilliant presentation. And from a historian's point of view, like my own, just the richness of the archive and the way you explained what one can find in there, because that's ultimately the gold standard of our discipline. I'm sure I'm not alone in listening to your lecture. I'm thinking of our contemporary world and the crisis in Israel, Palestine, and in hearing you say, pointing to certain essential attributes of successful back-channel negotiations, the short chain, the trust, limited trust, the fostering of trust, and then, of course, the big one, openness to major constructive change. And I don't know if you'd like to respond on that particular case I'm alluding to, or just expand a little bit on what you see as the attributes of successful back-channel negotiating.
Well, I mean, the classic sort of scholarly texts on negotiation begin by saying, if one party doesn't want a deal, no deal will happen. Negotiation is not about sort of there's a magic trick that's going to get everybody to agree. There's, different sides have positions. If they don't want to move towards an overall settlement, then they won't take things in that direction. And even if they would like an overall settlement, like the British in 1975, if it seemed, I think in 75, it seemed really difficult, that there was a possibility you could have a settlement, but there was going to be an awful lot of work involved, and it seemed to them that maybe the IRA campaign was going to peter out anyway. So it didn't seem like a good direction. I think some of the things apply in the sense that, will the others, I mean, I don't want to get into the sort of, Hamas-Israel negotiations and exchanges, but it is very striking that even in those circumstances, you can have this limited deal. They say they're going to do it, they do it. The other side say they're going to do it, they do it. That's, extraordinary. It shows when two sides have sort of very limited shared interest, that there is a kind of small zone of ground that all of these things apply. The handovers are not used as occasions to, attack, or, people come out into the open, but they aren't bombed in the open, things like this. So you have this very, very limited trust, and that's obviously essential and obvious. Yeah, but I mean, Again, you had repeated efforts at a settlement in Northern Ireland, 72, 75. The intermediary hoped in 1980, 81 that they would settle the hunger strikes and that might provide a platform to a broader settlement. And for him, the collapse of the hunger strike negotiations really destroyed the idea of a wider settlement. He thought if they can agree on something like that, maybe that can be provide a jumping off platform for a deeper engagement. But repeatedly, efforts failed. And eventually they succeeded. In the book, I give some reasons. I think they succeed. Partly it's about leadership control on both sides. Partly it's about strategic direction on both sides and where they want to go. So I just see that there are sort of 1, 2, and then 3 questions. I know you had your hand up for a while. Yes, go ahead.
Can you discuss how the Dublin government might have been seen in terms of being a back channel, either used or useless, useful, trusted, distrusted by either Republican or British government?
It's a great question, and it's worth a paper in its own right, because the British conceal these talks from the Irish government. That's sort of another defining feature. One reason is they don't want it to leak anywhere, so they want to absolutely minimize the number of people who know about it. What that meant during the 1975 ceasefire, the Irish government was very fearful that something might come out of this engagement between the IRA and the British government. So the Irish government quite hostile in 1975. The Irish government in the 90s gets completely on board, and that's crucial to the success of the whole process. And the Irish government actually in the late 1980s opens up its own back channel with the IRA before the British do. A couple of years before the British do, and it's at great risk. It's a big political risk for the Irish government of the time, and it involves directly, it's an initiative of the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach. It's an initiative from the very top. They have secret contacts with Sinn Féin, political party associated with the IRA, on the assumption Sinn Féin would speak for the IRA. So they're really important in the 90s and very valuable. And what John Chilcott, the British official who was crucial in the 90s, I said to him, did you know the Irish government had contacts? He said, well, you know, whether we knew or not, we always assumed they did. We just took it as read that they did. But I think one reason the British set up their own channel in 1990, 91 may have been partly because they knew the Irish government was in contact and they thought, actually, we need our own direct line of communication here. We can't leave it to the Irish government. So yeah, it's a mixed story, but ultimately very valuable in the 90s. But I mean, there's a lot of hilarious stories around this, and I write a little bit about this in the book, but when it was revealed in 1993 publicly that the British were had secretly been talking to the IRA for 3 years, the Irish government was like, I can't believe you would do such a thing. This is disgraceful. How could you possibly? And they then pressured the British government. That helped them to pressure the British government into the Downing Street Declaration, which was a major step forward in the British position towards a sort of conciliatory approach to the Sinn Féin and the IRA. Now, many on the British side wanted that to happen. They actually welcomed this pressure. It had been difficult to get them. But what I say in the book is I sort of trace who's talking to who. And I reckon the Irish government know a year before it's revealed that the British have this channel. It's absolute. So they've known for a while, but they're not telling the British that they know. And then they just use it when it comes out there. What a disgrace. But yeah. Sorry, so then I think Dan, you were next. Okay. Yeah. So the answers are not all that I don't know. I frankly don't know. But I mean, clearly it's a reference to Germany and the German involvement. Presumably, it's a reference to 5 different, I'm guessing 5 different channels or 5 different sets of communication, because the British are putting out feelers to other people they've been in contact before. So maybe a reference to their conversation with, and none of the other lines work. And the Brendan Duddy, this interview, it works. And it works because the others are giving them firm information. This is recorded by the British. They're saying this, that, and the other, which turns out to be wrong. And Duddy is not giving them firm information. He's saying, this is what I'm hearing. This is what it looks like. I don't know. I can't tell you beyond that. So he's more cautious than the others. He's not over-promising, but he's nonetheless actually getting them close to what has happened. Sorry.
Jumping off on your question about the techniques or what it took to negotiate, I'm wondering about the historical context of this. What changed by the 90s that made them willing to come closer? Because I think that that also has some kind of relationship to thinking about other long-term conflicts. I mean, this could have gone on and on and on. What had changed?
No, that's a great question. And that's actually, I mean, that's at the heart of the answer. You know, that helps to answer it. Again, the scholarship on ending of civil wars talks about mutually hurting stalemates and ripe moments. And, you know, there was for a while a consensus that it's when the parties realize there's a stalemate and that neither of them is going to have an outright military victory. But the argument I make in the book is actually both sides hit that point around 1972, 20-something years before it ended. Now, the British did hope at certain phase, they're like, okay, they seem to be trailing off. Maybe even for their own political purposes, they might actually bring an end to it because it has certain damaging impacts on them, quite serious damaging impacts. But the sense that actually we are not going to overwhelm them militarily, that's stated openly by senior British government generals in the 1970s. They're like, this is not going to be won militarily, this is going to be won through political settlement. So they're willing to say that openly. And in the 90s, again, senior military people are willing to say that. So you have a stalemate for a long time. I'll just sort of touch on a couple of factors that I think are important. One is there are no serious challengers to the IRA by the 1990s. During the 1975 ceasefire, there's another radical, violent Republican group that has just emerged called the INLA. As the IRA ceasefire continues, IRA members who are saying, what's with this ceasefire? We're getting nothing. It's going nowhere. I want to get back to the fight with the British. They join the INLA. And the INLA is not on ceasefire. And so even though the IRA is on ceasefire, the conflict is continuing. Therefore, the military presence continues. Therefore, so they don't have, by the 90s, that competing forces are gone. So when the IRA stops things, they stop. The other thing is that the leadership in the mid-1970s is not as fully in control of the movement. They're able to call a ceasefire. It holds, but it's constantly creaking. There are people saying, what the hell is it? There's people who want to go back. They're under relentless pressure. The leadership in the 90s has spent years securing control of the leadership. It's moved decision-making up different levels. So it's moved decision on IRA operations have been moved further up the hierarchy. Power has been more concentrated near the top. They're able, when it comes to very difficult compromises, they're able to bring almost the entire movement with them. So those are, I mean, there's much more to say, but having a strongly, and the same on the British side, 75 talks. Harold Wilson is very weak. He's at the end of his political career. His cabinet is divided. He's actually not a strong, powerful prime minister. Tony Blair, who eventually signs the agreement, has an extraordinary majority in Parliament, can take much more risks. So there are a few things like that. Sorry, I see there's a couple of questions there.
Thank you so much for sharing your archival treasure. They're amazing. And this is a question. in the past 50 years or so, we have witnessed a lot of political upheaval all over the world. And if we know that history repeats itself, that's what they say. What is your speculation for the next 50 years?
Okay, I hesitate to speculate. I what I think sort of what's striking about the conflict in Northern Ireland, so it doesn't compare to the scale of many other conflicts in the world. Several thousand people were killed, but it was over a span of many years, but in a small place with a population of around 1.5 million at the outbreak of the conflict. But it was exceptional in a West European democracy. It was like there was nowhere else in Western Europe in the 60s, 70s, 80s that had that level of violence. And yet, Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, one of the oldest and most stable democratic systems in the world. It had experienced internal rebellion before, the Irish War of Independence, which led to independence for most of Ireland. But Northern Ireland, despite some sort of abuses of the electoral system, had a pretty standard majority rule electoral system. It was just one that was used to allow permanent domination of one group by the other. I guess what I'm saying is long-standing democratic institutions and traditions don't inoculate against collapse into political violence. I think that's the only point. And when it happened, what's really striking is that people are shocked. Even the people involved. I spoke to someone who organized the first civil rights march in Derry. He said, we organized it. We wanted to confront the police. He said, I couldn't believe what happened. Large-scale rioting broke out. He said it seemed completely out of proportion to, the situation that we were working in. He was totally shocked by and it just showed the fragility of that social peace. Anyway, so what to predict for the next 50 years? Well, so many people are talking about democracy doesn't inevitably expand and progress and become more widespread. There's also retreat and backsliding and real dangers to democratic institutions. Yes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture. I don't think I've heard too many people say that British were very good at colonialism and had a very positive way of going about it. But to build on the question that the historian in the other room asked about intermediaries, has there been any findings around the character of an intermediary themselves in terms of like their age, their demographic, their position in society, and what makes like a profile, say, of somebody who could be a good biased intermediary? And is there any scope for using that in terms of diplomacy or international conflict resolution going forward to like profile and pick out someone that you might not be connected to and use them as an intermediary?
I should say, about the colonialism, because obviously I'm not pro-colonialism, but British colonialism of the 1960s and 70s is a colonialism of withdrawal. It's kind of an interesting, it's a colonialism that is dismantling itself, often reluctantly, but nonetheless, these are people who are used to getting out of places. There's a book by an Israeli academic called Lior Lairs, which compares the intermediaries of this kind, so Brendan Duddy is one of his cases, intermediaries in South Africa, Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, in precisely that way, what are the characteristics? And he talks about their kind of stamina, their ability to just keep on going in an apparently hopeless situation as part of it. You'll notice, this is also male. It's really male. The first women appear in these encounters in the early 90s. For the first time, you get British intelligence officers in meetings who are women. But up to then, the women appear in one capacity as the wives of intelligence officers, which is playing a role, so the intermediary is talking also to the wife of Michael Oatley, who's telling him about Oatley's political position and where he's going. But that's how women appear. So very male, this kind of persistence and stamina. There's a quote from one of the interviews I did with Brendan Duddy, where he said, you know, I just got up every day and I went into it with no expectation of success. And that was kind of a crucial thing, to keep going with no expectation that you were, and actually it's a succession of failures. You know, it's a succession of attempts that ultimately fail until the 1990s. Yeah, so what about I think I noticed in a memoir by somebody who tried to act as an intermediary in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. He said, you know, I was on my way to give the Prime Minister, Unionist Prime Minister at the time, Brian Faulkner, a message that might have stayed off internment. But, you know, I was 50 miles from his house. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. I was so tired. I stopped and I stayed overnight somewhere. By the time I got to him the next day, you know, it was too late. Internment had been in. I was like, Brendan Duddy would not have stopped and gone to sleep. He would have kept on driving. He would have gone to the house, whether it would have made a difference or not. So absolute persistence. And he wore people out. That was,
We'll continue the conversation downstairs. We'll invite everybody to join us for a reception. And just to thank Niall for such an engaging and accessible insight into this critically important topic. Thank you so much.
thank you.